They gave us the mourning window because the compact required it. That is the first thing you need to understand. Not the Karathi's patience, not their planning, not the quiet precision of what they did while we were still counting our dead from the Tarun bombardment. You need to understand the window first. The compact of recognized signatories, 114 alien civilizations. Their seals pressed into the treaty membrane that governs warfare and reprisal between member states had a provision that no one among us had ever had reason to examine before the Tarun. Provision 38. Mandatory mourning recognition. When a signatory civilization sustains civilian mass casualties in excess of 4 million souls, all other signatories are required to recognize a 90-day mourning period during which the grieving civilization may not be compelled to respond to any formal legal instrument, may not be cited for treaty violations, may not be lawfully subjected to administrative actions under the Compact's governance framework. 90 days of recognized grief. It was meant to be humane. It was meant to honor the dead. The Karathi hegemony read it differently. I've spent 11 years carrying what I know about those 90 days. I have carried it across 4 ground assignments, through 2 homecomings, through the testimony I gave before the Compact's Provisional Reconstruction Commission, through the nights when sleep wouldn't hold, and I would find myself sitting at the edge of whatever bunk I'd been assigned, turning the numbers over, the way you turn a stone you've carried so long. The edges have worn smooth. 19,407. That is the number I always come back to. Not the 445,000 warships. Not the 11 Karathi administrative worlds. Not the 43 station annexation files the hegemony had prepared in advance, pre-stamped and pre-indexed, waiting to be submitted the moment our mourning window opened. 19,407. The number of human beings the Karathi hegemony chemically quieted, filed as non-responsive cognitive wards under Hegemony Welfare Provision 6, NOC, and registered as administrative property of the Karathi state while we were still burying what the Tarun had left of 6 cities on 4 worlds. That is what I carry. And because I carry it, I will tell you exactly what happened, and I will not soften any part of it. My name is Neka Osei. I held the rank of Sergeant Major in the Coalition Marine Strike Corps for 22 years. I served in 7 active deployments before the mandate. I am retired now, and I have given this testimony before, but I give it again here because the record requires living witnesses, and I am one of the last who walked the station floors before the recovery teams came in after us. If my account differs in any particular from the mandate's official reconstruction, assume my account is correct. I was there. The official reconstruction was assembled from logs. I will begin where I was when the Karathi moved. On the 41st day of our compact-mandated mourning window, I was stationed aboard the coalition recovery vessel Ardent Remembrance, doing what every human vessel in recognized compact space was doing during those 90 days. Nothing. We were not permitted to conduct offensive operations. We were not permitted to respond to administrative filings. We were not permitted to enforce our own treaty rights within the framework of the Compact's governance structure. We were grieving, officially and legally, and the Compact's framework had locked us inside that grief the way you lock a door from the outside. The Ardent Remembrance was running supply lines between Kadra Station and the Mar Corridor's outer transit points. Transit work. Movement of relief materials to the Tarun adjacent sectors, still processing survivor populations. Unglamorous. Necessary. We had a crew of 41 and a complement of 12 Marines assigned as standard security for a vessel operating in the buffer corridors where the Compact's traffic designations overlapped with 3 different jurisdictional claims. I was the ranking Marine. My team consisted of 11 others. Corporal Adisa Tunde, Specialist Farai Mwangi, Lance Corporals Yeva Petrovich and Dao Shulin, and 7 others whose names I have given before and will give again here: Halverson, Subramaniam, Mbeki, Okori, Devereaux, Castillo, Park, 12 Marines, 41 crew. We were carrying medical polymer sheeting and atmospheric filtration units for the survivor processing stations at the far edge of the corridor. On day 41, the transit buoy at Relay Point Mara 7 South went dark. It was not the first buoy to go dark during the morning window. The Taroon bombardment had fractured infrastructure across a wide sector, and relay outages were common enough that I didn't give it particular weight when our signals officer, Ensign Petra Dahl, flagged it in her morning report. Mara 7 South had been intermittent for weeks. I noted it, I moved on. On day 43, Cadres Station itself went quiet. Cadres was not a small installation. It handled approximately 600 transits per standard day, housed a permanent population of 3,000 administrative and logistics personnel, and served as the primary waypoint for 11 human vessels running the Mara corridor at any given time. 3 of those vessels were running medical supply chains for the Taroon survivor sectors. When Cadres went quiet, no traffic signals, no routine administrative pings, no scheduled departure logs, the Ardent Remembrance's captain, Commander Ilsa Haverford, escalated immediately to Coalition Command. Coalition Command's response arrived 11 hours later. The delay is important. 11 hours in which no one had a clear answer, and the morning window was still 47 days from closing. The response told us that Cadres Station had been placed under Karathi Hegemony Administrative Administration under the provisions of Hegemony Welfare Provision 6, NOC, pending formal compact recognition of the station's population as non-responsive cognitive wards in need of hegemony welfare services, and that the Karathi had filed the appropriate instruments with the compact's administrative secretariat on day 39 of our morning window, and that the instruments had been received and logged, and that because the instruments were civil welfare filings rather than treaty violations, the compact's framework did not recognize them as actions requiring a response from the grieving party during a Provision 38 window. Coalition Command's message said one more thing. It said that we were not, under any circumstances, to approach Cadres Station or any of the other transit installations that had gone quiet, because approach would constitute a treaty response to a civil filing during a protected mourning period, which would void our Provision 38 protections and expose the coalition to reprisal under 4 separate compact enforcement articles. I read that message twice. I set it down. Then I went to the forward observation post at the bow of the Ardent Remembrance, where there was a narrow porthole that looked out into transit corridor space. And I stood there for a long time, looking at nothing, because there was nothing to see. Cadres was 11 light minutes away and getting further, and I was a sergeant major in the Coalition Marine Strike Corps with 12 Marines under my command and nothing I was permitted to do. I have been asked many times what I felt in that moment. I always give the same answer. I felt a specific kind of anger that has no name I know of in any language I speak. Not rage, nothing like rage. Rage burns and moves and seeks a target. This was the opposite. This was something that goes very still. Something that understands, with complete clarity, that the time for doing anything useful has not yet come, and so it waits. It stores. It does not waste itself on an action that cannot matter yet. I went back to my Marines. I told them what I knew. I told them we were going to wait. By the time the morning window entered its final week, the count of installations placed under Karathi Welfare Provision 6, NOC, had reached 7. 7 transit stations. Among them, Cadres, as I have said, the Mara Corridor's primary relay hub at Station Korath 9. 2 humanitarian waypoints in the Taroon buffer sector that had been running survivor transport. A deep corridor medical distribution depot called Havel's Point that had handled filtration and pharmaceutical supply for 63 worlds. A fuel and resupply installation called the Rennick Platform that served 31 coalition vessels operating in the outer corridors. And a station I will name last because it is the one I still cannot list without a particular heaviness settling in behind my sternum. The Vela Compact Processing Station, which had been a civilian waypoint, family-run, multi-generational, serving the small communities of traders and independent logistics operators who had worked the Mara corridor for 4 decades. Each station had been processed under Provision 6, NACH identically. The Karathi had sent what they called welfare assessment teams, small vessels, lightly crewed, carrying a compound, the hegemony's documentation described as a cognitive stabilization agent for non-responsive populations. The document used the phrase non-responsive populations to mean something very specific: human beings who were grieving. Every human being on those 7 stations had been in the Tarun mourning window. Every human being on those 7 stations had people to mourn, supply chains disrupted, family members in the survivor sectors. Grief is not catatonia. Grief does not make you non-responsive. But grief can be cataloged. It can be documented. And if your welfare framework defines its own criteria for what constitutes a non-responsive cognitive state, if you write those criteria broadly enough, and if you deploy a compound that has the convenient property of inducing the state your criteria describe, then the filing becomes self-fulfilling. The Karathi had not found non-responsive populations on those 7 stations. They had created them. The compound was called VEN-SAR. We did not have a name for it until after the mandate had completed its work, and our forensic teams had time to analyze the residual biological trace in the station atmospheres. What VEN-SAR did, in terms that do not require a biochemistry background, is this. It suspended the neural pathways associated with motivated volitional response, while leaving the body's maintenance functions intact. People continued to breathe. Their hearts continued to beat. They could swallow if food was placed in their mouths. They could blink. They gave no other responses to external stimuli. They sat or lay or slumped against whatever surface they had been near when the compound reached them, and they remained there. And they looked at nothing. And they thought, if thought is even the right word, whatever interior thoughts the compound allowed them, which our medical teams later characterized as probably something between a sustained fugue and a very deep, very isolated silence. 19,407 human beings filed as non-responsive cognitive wards, registered as Karathi state property under the administrative ownership provisions of Welfare Provision 6, NOC. On day 39 of our mourning window, the Karathi submitted 7 transit station annexation packets to the Compact's administrative secretariat. Each packet was between 400 and 900 pages. Each packet cited the station's now registered Provision 6 NOC ward population as the legal basis for administrative assumption. Each packet had been prepared, our analysts determined this later, from the document metadata between 8 and 14 months before the Tarun bombardment. Before Earth and its coalition had had 6 cities atomized and 4 worlds partially glassed and 6,400,000 civilians killed in an attack that triggered Provision 38 of the Compact Mourning Framework. The Karathi had been waiting for a mourning window, not specifically our mourning window. The 6 NOC framework, our analysts found, had been refined and tested over a period of 7 years in anticipation of the first opportunity to use it. The Tarun bombardment happened to give them 1. If the Tarun had not struck us, some other mass casualty event from some other antagonist would have served equally well. The Karathi had built the mechanism. They had stocked the compound. They had written the welfare criteria. They had prepared 43 separate annexation packets for 43 separate human installations of varying strategic value, and they had filed 7 of them in week 6 of our mourning window, before the Compact's administrative processing framework created a backlog that slowed the remaining 36. They had calculated that we would not know until the window closed. They had calculated that when we did know, we would face a completed legal fait accompli, 7 stations already annexed, their populations already registered, the Compact instruments already filed and received. They had calculated that the cost of legal challenge within the Compact framework would be prohibitive, that the case law was thin, that the hegemony's Welfare Provision 6 NOC apparatus had been constructed precisely to exploit the gap between military reprisal law, which the Compact governed tightly, and civil welfare administration, which it governed almost not at all. They had calculated all of this with what I can only describe as administrative thoroughness. The Karathi hegemony was not a young civilization. It had existed, in one form or another, for something between 14 and 17 centuries, depending on how you date its consolidation period. And in that time, it had become expert in the mechanics of slow institutional advantage. It did not win conflicts through military dominance. Its fleet was not remarkable. It won through patience, through the identification and exploitation of framework gaps, through the careful accumulation of administrative advantage across timescales that younger civilizations did not think to defend against. 7 years to build the 6 Nach apparatus. 7 years is nothing to a civilization that measures strategic planning in centuries. What they had missed, what their 7 centuries of framework exploitation had not equipped them to understand, is a different question. I will come to it. The weeks between day 43 and day 89 were the longest I have served in 22 years of uniform. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I have served in engagements where the duration of the threat was measured in hours, and the weight of each hour was considerable. I've held defensive positions with casualties accumulating and reinforcement uncertain, and the arithmetic of survival working steadily in the wrong direction. Those hours are heavy, but they move. They move because there is work to do inside them. Decisions, actions, the constant forward pressure of a situation that demands response. The weeks between day 43 and day 89 were heavy in a different way, because there was no work to do. We were in the mourning window. We were not permitted to work. We were required, legally and formally, to be unable to respond. What we did instead was run supply lines. The Ardent Remembrance continued its transit runs. We delivered polymer sheeting to the Tarun survivor sectors. We picked up filtration units and medication pallets and water reclamation equipment and moved them where the reconstruction planning said they were needed. The work was real and it mattered, and it was also, in those weeks, the most effective way I know to carry something you cannot put down. You do not stop carrying it when you are working. You carry it alongside the work. After a while, you stop noticing the weight separately from the work itself. They become the same thing. The intelligence updates came in through our command channel, encrypted and tightly held. We got them every 3 days. Each one extended the count of stations operating under Provision 6, Nach. And each one was accompanied by the same advisory. Do not approach, do not respond, do not take any action that could be characterized as a treaty response during the protected mourning period. The advisory did not change. The count did. Day 43, Kadris Station, 3,011 wards registered. Day 47, Station Korath 9, 4,182 wards registered. Day 51, Havel's Point, 2,007 wards registered. Day 54, the first humanitarian waypoint, station designation Tarun Buffer 7, which had been running survivor transport for the very populations we were mourning. 1,709 wards registered. Day 59, the second humanitarian waypoint, designation Tarun Buffer 12, 2,241 wards registered. Day 63, the Rennick platform, 3,058 wards registered. Day 67, Vela Compact Processing Station, 1,083 wards registered. I kept a private count, separate from the official logs, on a piece of actual paper that I folded and kept in the same breast pocket where I later kept the family unit's data chip. I kept it on paper because I wanted the act of writing each number to be a physical thing, something that cost something, even if what it cost was only the 30 seconds it took to write by hand. Subramaniam saw me updating it once and did not ask what it was. He knew, they all knew, we had been in the same compartment for 46 days of it by then. There is a particular quality of shared awareness that develops in a Marine unit during an extended period of enforced restraint. You do not discuss it much. You do not need to. By day 67, the running total was 19,407. The updates after day 67 reported no new stations. The Compact's administrative processing backlog, which our command analyst determined had created a 36-packet delay in the Karathi's filing queue, had apparently stalled the Hegemony's program before the remaining 36 annexation packets could be submitted. 19,407 was the final number. I did not know that then. I found it out later. What I knew on day 67 was the number on my paper and the weight of it, and 23 days left in the mourning window. I did not write anything on the paper after day 67. I did not need to. The number was complete. The last 23 days of the mourning window passed without a further intelligence update about the stations. What came instead were the logistics updates, the kind that do not announce themselves as what they are. Our resupply requests began being fulfilled faster than usual. The polymer sheeting we were running for the survivor sectors suddenly had priority routing attached. Twice in the final week, coalition vessels we had not seen in the Mara corridor before fell into transit formation with us for 4 to 6 hours and then peeled away without communication beyond the standard navigational courtesies. I did not know at the time whether those vessels were part of the mandate's assembly. I assumed they were. I did not ask, because we were still inside the mourning window and the mourning window had ears. And the one thing that the mandate required above all was that the Karathi not know it was coming until it was already there. I kept running supply lines. I kept the paper in my pocket. I kept the number where I could find it. On the 89th day of the mourning window, I was summoned to Commander Haverford's ready room. She handed me a message chip. I read it. It contained 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph told me that the coalition's military command had been aware of the Karathi action since day 43 and had been preparing a response since day 44. The second paragraph told me that the response had been named the Grieving Mandate and that it consisted of 445,000 warships drawn from every coalition fleet, reserve formation, and rapid deployment group in recognized space, and that had been assembled in staging corridors selected for their distance from compact monitoring installations, and that the assembly had taken 45 days, and that the mandate would deploy at the precise second the Provision 38 window closed. The third paragraph told me that the Ardent Remembrance and its Marine complement had been reassigned to Mandate Ground Reclamation Group 7, which would be responsible for the physical recovery of the Vela Compact Processing Station and its ward population once the mandate's fleet elements had cleared the surrounding space. The fourth paragraph was 2 sentences. The first sentence said, "You will find them exactly as they were left." The second sentence said, "Your orders are to bring them home." I folded the chip. I went back to my Marines. I told them everything. There was a silence in the compartment that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Corporal Tunde broke it. He said, very quietly, 445,000. Not a question. Just repeating the number the way you repeat something to make sure you heard it correctly. I said yes. He nodded once and said nothing else. None of them said anything else. They began checking their equipment. Halverson cleaned his kit. Subramaniam ran diagnostics on the Ardent Remembrance's medical support frame because we had just been told we were going to need it. Park restacked the portable atmospheric filtration canisters we had been carrying for the Taru and survivor sectors and repurposed them in her manifest as station air quality support. Petrovich and Shulin went to the cargo hold and redistributed weight to account for the extra medical payload we would need to take on. Nobody raged. Nobody wept. 12 Marines, preparing. Mwangi asked me one question at the end, when the others had dispersed to their tasks. She asked whether the Karathi would be given the opportunity to respond to the mandate's deployment notification before the fleet translated in. I told her no. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already worked out for herself, and went back to her equipment check. I want to be precise about why the answer was no, because it has been characterized incorrectly in some of the records I've reviewed since my retirement. The mandate did not deny the Karathi a response window out of anger or out of a desire to deny them the dignity of an ultimatum. The mandate denied them a response window because the Karathi had denied their 19,407 wards a response window. Provision 38 existed to ensure that a civilization in recognized grief could not be legally compelled to respond to instruments filed against them. The Karathi had used that provision as the mechanism for their action. It was appropriate that the instrument answering that action operate on the same principle. No response window, no diplomatic notification. The mandate deployed at the exact second the window closed, and the Karathi were informed of what was happening as it was happening. The same way our people on those 7 stations were informed of what the Karathi were doing by finding themselves inside it before they had any opportunity to prepare. That is not cruelty. That is accuracy. At the exact second the mourning window ended, and I do mean the exact second, because the mandate's deployment orders were keyed to the timestamp and the fleet moved at Tizerol 445,000 coalition warships translated out of their staging corridors, I did not see it. I was nowhere near it. I have since reviewed the long-range sensor reconstructions, and I have seen the records, and I will tell you what they show because it matters for the shape of what the mandate was. The fleet did not emerge in a single system. It did not mass in one place and drive toward the Karathi. The mandate had been designed over 45 days of meticulous planning that I later learned had involved every coalition strategic analyst, every operational commander, and a team of compact legal scholars working alongside them to arrive simultaneously at every target. 11 Karathi administrative worlds, 7 annexed human transit stations. Every Karathi military installation within operational reach of a coalition fleet group, and the hegemony's 3 primary administrative centers, where the officials who had signed the 6 NOC annexation packets maintained their offices simultaneously. To the second, the Karathi had prepared for many things. They had not prepared for this. Their calculation had been that the coalition would pursue a legal remedy through the compact first, would spend months or years in administrative challenge, and that by the time military options were seriously considered, the 7 stations would be so integrated into the Karathi administrative framework that extraction would be diplomatically catastrophic. They had calculated that we would treat the annexation as a legal problem requiring a legal solution. What they had missed entirely and fatally was the specific character of what they had done during our mourning window. You do not use a civilization's grief as a weapon and then assume that civilization will respond through the mechanism designed to prevent weapons from being used. The compact's legal framework was built on the premise that signatory civilizations would prefer managed conflict to total war. That preference is not unconditional. The Karathi had found the condition under which it does not apply. What you have taken from people in their grief while they were holding their dead and their survivors and their broken infrastructure together and submitting legally and in good faith to a framework that was supposed to protect them, that is not a legal problem. That is a debt of a different kind. And 45 days of preparation is enough time to build the instrument for paying it. I arrived at the Vela Compact Processing Station on the 3rd day of the mandate's ground phase. The fleet elements assigned to our sector had completed their work before we arrived. I do not say completed lightly, and I do not say work as a euphemism for something I am unwilling to name. The mandate's mission parameters were specific and had been drafted with full legal review under the provisions of coalition military law and the subset of compact articles that govern reprisal operations against administrative seizure. The Karathi installations within our sector had been neutralized. The 3 Karathi administrative vessels that had been maintaining the 6, NOC filing over the Vela station, the ones that had delivered the Vensar compound and established the welfare administration apparatus, were no longer present. That is accurate. That is all I will say about the fleet's work in this sector, because the fleet's work is not my testimony to give. What is mine to give is what I found when I boarded Vela station. We docked through the secondary bay. The primary docking arms had been retracted by the Karathi administrative crew during their tenure, a measure we later determined to prevent any unauthorized access during the ward population period. We burned through a maintenance hatch with a cutting frame and moved in 2 by 2, Tunde and Mwangi on point, Petrovich and Shulin covering the secondary corridor junctions, the rest of the squad stacked behind me with the medical support equipment in a cart we'd rigged from the cargo hold. The atmospheric sensors I was carrying registered the station air as clear. The Vensar compound was a fast metabolite. It dispersed in an unaugmented atmosphere within 6 to 8 hours of the delivery system being shut down. The Karathi administrative crew had shut their systems down before departing, which meant the compound had been clearing for somewhere between 18 and 24 hours by the time we entered. This is the thing I want to be careful about describing correctly. It is not that the station was silent. Silence implies an absence, a place where sound should be and isn't. Vela Station had its ambient sound. the ventilation cycling, the hum of the power distribution grid, a loose panel somewhere in the Corridor B access run that had been vibrating against its housing probably for weeks and hadn't been repaired because the maintenance crew was among the 19,407. What the station did not have was the sound of people. Not because there were no people on the station, there were people everywhere. We found the first of them in the corridor outside the secondary docking bay. A man, human, middle-aged, in the kind of worn logistics coveralls that the independent operators who worked the Mara corridor favored, reinforced at the knees, pockets along the thighs, a personal name tag on the breast pocket. He was seated against the bulkhead with his legs stretched in front of him and his hands in his lap, and he was looking at the middle distance with a specific quality of focus that is not focus at all. That is its opposite. That is the expression of a person whose eyes are open and whose mind is somewhere the eyes cannot follow. I knelt in front of him. I moved my hand into his line of sight. His eyes did not track it. His respiration was slow and regular. His pulse, when I checked it, was steady. He was alive. He was entirely, completely, unreachably elsewhere. I stood up. I looked at Tunde. He had found two more in the adjacent corridor. A woman in station administrative gray, seated at the base of a conduit housing. A teenager, maybe 16, in the casual dress of a kid who had grown up on a corridor way station and wore station life as naturally as skin. Both of them the same, eyes open, breath steady, unreachable. We spread through the station in the systematic way we had planned. Each pair of Marines covered a section, assessed the wards they found, logged position and basic vitals, marked them for medical extraction. The coalition medical teams were behind us. They had the actual treatment protocols, the biochemical reversal agents our research teams had developed in the 45 days of the mandate's preparation. And our job was to move through first, account for everyone, secure the space, and prepare for the medical wave. Standard reclamation procedure for a mass casualty space environment. I have been in mass casualty environments. I have pulled people out of vacuum-exposed corridors and out of atmosphere fires and out of pressurized hull sections after blowout events. This was different from all of those in a way that I think is worth naming. In every other mass casualty environment I have operated in, the nature of the harm is visible. Burns, or decompression injury, or structural trauma, the body shows what has happened to it, and the showing tells you what to do. Walking through Vela Station, the wards showed nothing. They sat, or slumped, or lay on their sides where they had been when the compound reached them, in postures that were random and human the way people are when they're working or moving or having a conversation, and then the ground stops being there, and they looked at nothing, and their bodies were intact, and there was nothing externally visible to indicate that anything had happened to them at all. If you did not know, you might have thought they were sleeping. You might have thought there was something wrong with your eyes, some collective trick of the light. The station's records were still running when we entered. The Karathi administrative crew had not thought to shut down the station's internal logging systems, probably because the logs were of no consequence to them. They were civil welfare administrators, not soldiers, and the concept of evidentiary records was not, it seemed, front of mind when they departed. What this meant is that we had complete atmospheric sensor records, internal camera records, and administrative log timestamps for the entirety of the VENSAR deployment and the subsequent 6 knock filing process. I turned those records over to our command liaison on day 4 of the ground phase. I was told later they formed a significant part of the mandate's legal record before the compact assembly. I believe that is probably true, because what those records showed was not ambiguous. They showed the Karathi welfare team entering through the primary docking bay. They showed the atmospheric injection sequence beginning 11 minutes after docking. They showed the compound reaching full station saturation in approximately 22 minutes. They showed the ward population in the condition I have described. And they showed the Karathi administrative staff moving through the station for the next 3 days, documenting their wards, completing their filing, conducting their welfare assessments on 19,407 people who were in no position to participate in or object to any of it. There was a family in the Vela Station's crew quarter block, parents and 3 children. The parents were in the small, common area outside their quarters, the mother seated at the table with a data reader still in her hand, the father half standing near the counter where the family's beverage unit sat, his cup on the surface in front of him, probably set down a half second before the compound reached him. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 12, was in the corridor just outside the quarters, where she had apparently been coming back from somewhere, still wearing a jacket, a bag over one shoulder. The younger two were in the quarters themselves, a boy of 8 or 9, cross-legged on the floor in front of a display screen that was still running a story program, its audio playing at low volume, into a room where no one was listening. A girl of 5 or 6, asleep on a small bunk, which was the only reason she didn't look immediately like the others, because she looked like a child sleeping, until you noticed that her breath was too slow and too even and her face was too still. I stood in the doorway of that family's quarters for longer than I should have, given the pace our sweep required. I am not going to describe what I felt, because it is not the kind of thing that translates into testimony, and because what I felt is less important than what I observed. What I observed was this. The Karathi had moved through this station and through 6 others like it, and they had done this to 19,407 people. This specific, intimate thing, this thing that reached into each individual person and switched off the part of them that was present, and they had filed paperwork about it. And they had submitted the paperwork to an administrative body during the 90 days when we were legally prevented from responding. And the paperwork was in order, and the compound had dispersed cleanly, and the hegemony's welfare provision had worked exactly as designed. I stepped back from the doorway, I keyed my radio and gave the section clear signal for the quarter block and requested a priority medical team for the family unit. Then I kept moving. The full sweep of Vela Station took 11 hours. We accounted for all 1,083 wards on the station's 6 knock filing. We found them in corridors, in workspaces, in dining areas, in mechanical maintenance runs where some of them had been when the compound cycled through the atmospheric systems. We found 4 who had been in EVA prep at the time they were in the suit locker, halfway through pre-flight checks, and the compound had reached them through the suit's atmospheric interface before the external seals closed, which meant we found them in partial EVA kit, which is a specific image I have returned to many times. We found one who had been in the medical bay, the station's doctor, I learned later, a woman named Reyes Adisa Chamberlain, who had been treating a minor laceration on a cargo tech's forearm when the compound reached both of them, and they were found together, the doctor still holding a closure strip she had been about to apply, the cargo tech's forearm still on the examination surface. We found the station administrator, a man named Kofi Achempong, at his desk in the administrative office with 11 open documents on his display and a half-finished notation in the margin of a transit scheduling file. He had been working. He had been in the middle of a sentence. The medical teams came in behind us and began the reversal protocol. The biochemical reversal for Vensar exposure, which our research teams had developed from the compound's known structure and from the analysis of the first Vensar samples recovered from the initial compact forensic assessment of Cadre Station in week 9 of the morning window, was a course of 3 injections, 6 hours apart, with continuous atmospheric support and vital monitoring throughout. Full emergence from the Vensar state took between 18 and 36 hours, depending on the depth of exposure and the individual's metabolic baseline. During emergence, wards experienced what the medical teams described as a progressive return, sensory awareness coming back before motor function, recognition before speech, the interior self climbing back toward the surface of the person, the way you climb toward light when you have been somewhere dark. I was not present for many of the emergences. That was the medical team's work, and they were extraordinarily good at it. I was present for 2. The first was the cargo tech, whose forearm had been on the examination surface in the medical bay. He came back faster than average 22 hours from the first injection. I happened to be running a secondary sweep of the medical bay when his eyes refocused, and I was close enough that I was the first thing he clearly saw. He looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds with the particular expression of a person whose brain is trying to catch the world up to itself. Then he said, in a voice that had the rough, dragged quality of someone speaking for the first time in however long it had been. What happened? Not a question. More like he was reading words off a page he could barely make out. I told him as plainly and as briefly as I could. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How long?" I told him. He nodded slowly, as though he had half expected the answer. He asked about the station. I told him the coalition had control of Vela Station. He asked about the Karathi. I told him the mandate had completed its work. He lay back on the examination surface and stared at the ceiling and said nothing else for a long time. And I finished my sweep and let the medical team take over. And that was the extent of what passed between us. The second emergence I was present for was the child, the 5-year-old girl, in the bunk in her family's quarters. The reversal for children was more carefully staged, slower titration, closer monitoring, and she took 29 hours, which put her emergence at nearly the end of my ground assignment on the station. I was not in the quarters when it happened. I was in the corridor outside, completing final accounting on the family unit's records, when the medical specialist assigned to the family, a woman named Dr. Haru Watanabe, came out of the quarters and told me the youngest was back. I asked if she was aware. Dr. Watanabe said, "She's asking for her mother." Her mother was 40 hours from emergence. Her father, 36. Her siblings, scattered across the recovery timeline. I asked what they were telling her. Dr. Watanabe said that her mother is sleeping and will wake up soon, and that she is safe, and that the people who did this have been dealt with. I nodded. I finished my accounting. I put the data chip with the family unit's records into my breast pocket, because that is where I kept the things I needed to not lose. We completed ground reclamation at Vela Station on day 7 of the mandate's ground phase. The other 6 stations were running concurrent reclamation operations through separate ground groups. The final accounting, when all 7 stations had been swept and all recovery operations had been formally logged, put the recovered ward population at 19,402. 5 wards had not survived the Vensar exposure period. The Karathi's welfare provision, the one that was supposed to demonstrate their conscientious administration of the non-responsive population they had filed, had included a maintenance nutrition protocol that was adequate for baseline human physiology. It had not accounted for a diabetic maintenance requirement. The 5 wards who died had died of metabolic crisis in the first 20 days of the Provision 6 Nach administration. The Karathi welfare documentation noted the 5 deaths as complications of presenting non-responsive state, which is the kind of language you use when you want to acknowledge that people died in your care, without acknowledging that your care was responsible for their dying. I did not write that particular finding into my ground report. It was above my level to characterize. Our command structure handled the formal characterization. I will tell you only that the characterization was thorough, and that the documentation of all 5 deaths was preserved in full in the mandate's legal record, and that it was presented to the Compact's Emergency Oversight Assembly when that body convened in the aftermath of the mandate's completion. The mandate's completion. I have been asked to characterize the mandate's broader military action, the fleet elements, the 11 Karathi administrative worlds, the interdiction of Karathi military installations. And I will tell you what I can tell you as a ground marine who was running station reclamation while the fleet did its work. I know what the operational summary says. The Karathi hegemony's military capacity was neutralized. The 11 Karathi administrative worlds were placed under coalition administrative receivership pending compact oversight, with their civilian populations intact and under coalition humanitarian framework. The Karathi's 3 primary administrative centers, the bodies that had approved and signed the 6 Nach annexation instruments, were no longer functional as governmental entities when the mandate concluded its primary phase. The 43 annexation packets that had not yet been filed before the hegemony's administrative apparatus was neutralized were recovered from the hegemony's filing archives and formally voided under emergency coalition. Legal instrument. I know those things. I was not there for them. What I was there for is what I've already told you. What I will add is this. The mandate's framing as a military and legal document was precise in a way that I found when I eventually read the full text, deeply considered. The mandate named the Karathi action correctly, not as a treaty violation, because it technically was not the Karathi had found the gap between military reprisal law and civil welfare administration and had exploited it specifically because it was a gap and not a violation. The mandate named it as what it was: a deliberate action taken against human beings during a period of recognized grief, using those people's protected mourning status as a mechanism to prevent their civilization from responding while the action was carried out. The mandate named the compound. The mandate named the stations. The mandate named all 19,407 people by name, not as a list appended to an annex, but incorporated into the body of the document, every name as a stated and explicit subject of the mandate's action. This is why this was done. These are the people it was done to. This is their names. This is what we are here to answer. 445,000 warships, built in 45 days of silence and grief and preparation, deploying at the exact second the window closed, carrying every one of those names as their stated authority. I want to say something about the 45 days that I cannot verify from the outside, but that I believe based on what I know of the people who were in command during that period. When the mourning window opened after the Taroun bombardment, Earth and the coalition faced the specific agony of a civilization required to grieve openly while its governance and military structures continued to function in secret. The mourning window was real. The grief was real. 6,400,000 dead from the Taroun attack, and the coalition's leadership sitting in the ashes of that, and also, from day 43 onward, sitting with the knowledge of what the Karathi had done with the mourning window's opening. Running two things at once: the grief that was owed to the Taroun dead and the preparation that was owed to the 19,407. I believe, I cannot prove this, but I believe that the 45 days of the mandate's preparation were also 45 days of the most sustained, specific, cold-burning grief of the coalition's command history. Because you cannot know what the Karathi did on day 39 and feel nothing. You cannot be told about the Vensar compound and what it does and who it was used on and why the timing was chosen and simply file it under operational planning. The people who built the mandate carried it the same way I carried my 19,407, the way every person who knew carries what they know. You carry it and it is heavy and it does not get lighter. But it can be useful. That specific weight can become something with edges, something organized, something that knows exactly what it is for. That is what the grieving mandate was. Grief organized at scale. Not rage. Grief does not become rage when it is properly used, when it is given enough time and enough intention. It becomes something colder and more final than rage. It becomes something that does not waste itself on noise and does not stop at the sound of begging and does not need to announce itself before it completes its work. It simply completes the work. 445,000 warships, named for the grief they were built inside. I left Vela Station on the 8th day of the ground phase and returned to the Ardent Remembrance. We had been formally reassigned back to coalition supply operations, pending the mandate's administrative close. I sat in the forward observation compartment and looked out through the porthole at nothing in particular, corridor space, mostly. The distant gleam of hull plating from the mandate fleet element that had been tasked to this sector and was now in the process of withdrawing to staging areas for logistical stand-down. Tunde came and sat across from me. Neither of us said anything for a while. The porthole was not large enough to show you much. You could see a slice of corridor space and the edge of a distant planet, one of the Karathi's administrative worlds. I had lost track of which one at that point, and the very far rim of a coalition dreadnought pulling a long, slow turn on its transit heading. Eventually, Tunde said, "The ones that didn't make it." I said, 5. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "The 5 need to be somewhere, in the record." I told him they were in the record. The mandate's legal document had them. Their names, their circumstances, the documentation of their deaths under Karathi Welfare Administration. All of it. He said, "Not just the record. I mean, somewhere people will know to go when they want to think about why." I understood what he was asking. He was asking whether there would be a place, not a document, Not a legal filing, but a place where you could go and find those 5 names and know that they were seen, that the weight of them had been understood. I told him I did not know. I told him I thought someone would make sure of it. I thought that was the kind of thing that tends to get made sure of when enough people are carrying the same weight. He nodded. We sat there for a while longer. The dreadnought on the far transit heading completed its turn and moved away from the porthole's field of view, and corridor space was quiet around us, and the mandate was done. The compact's emergency oversight assembly convened 31 days after the mandate's conclusion. I was not present. I gave written testimony that was submitted as part of the mandate's evidentiary record and read into the assembly's official proceedings on day 3. I am told it was read in full. I have no way to verify that, but I was told by Coalition Command's legal liaison that the testimony was received without objection from any member of the assembly, and that the assembly's final record acknowledged the full account of the Vensar deployment, the 6 knock annexation mechanism, the selection of the Provision 38 mourning window as the operational timing, and the 19,407 names. The Assembly's findings are part of the Compact's permanent record. I will not characterize them here because they are a legal document and not mine to characterize. What I will say is that the Compact's welfare provision framework was revised in its aftermath. Welfare Provision 6, NOC, does not exist in its former form. The specific gap between military reprisal law and civil welfare administration that the Karathi had identified and exploited has been closed. It took 11 months of assembly work and the submissions of 37 member civilizations' legal delegations, but it is closed. No one can do again with civil welfare paperwork what the Karathi did with it. In a mourning window to 19,407 people, I do not know if that matters to the 5 who died. I believe it matters to the 19,402 who came back. There is one aspect of the Assembly's proceedings that I was told about secondhand and that I want to include because I think it belongs in the record, even if it does not belong to my direct testimony. The Karathi hegemony, in the aftermath of the mandate's completion, submitted a formal protest to the Compact's Oversight Assembly, characterizing the mandate as a disproportionate military response to a civil administrative action and requesting an immediate censure of the coalition and an emergency review of the mandate's legal basis. The protest was 1,200 pages. It cited 47 compact precedents and included a substantial section arguing that the mandate's simultaneous deployment to 11 Karathi administrative worlds constituted an act of total war against a civilian population, and that this was prohibited under Compact Article 71's provisions governing civilian population centers. The protest was received. It was logged. It was assigned a reference number. It was entered into the administrative queue for Compact Oversight Review. The queue, at the time of the Karathi protest submission, had a processing backlog of approximately 117 days. I do not believe this was an accident. There's one more thing I want to say before I close this testimony, and it is the thing I've said the least in every prior version of this account. Not because it is difficult to say, but because I was not certain how to say it in a way that was accurate. The Karathi calculated that grief meant weakness. They did not calculate it carelessly. They had 7 years of preparation. They had the Compact's framework mapped in precise detail. They had identified the specific window in which the legal constraints on our response would be at their tightest and our emotional state would be at its most consuming. They had determined from observation and analysis over those 7 years that a civilization in grief is a civilization turned inward, and that a civilization turned inward is a civilization that cannot see what is being done to it until too late, and that a civilization that cannot see until too late cannot respond until even later, and that by the time the response arrives, the conditions on the ground will have made it too costly to pursue. That was their calculation. It was not irrational. It is probably correct for most civilizations. What the Karathi had not understood, and what I think about when I cannot sleep, is that grief in human beings does not work the way they modeled it. It is not a turning inward that closes the eyes. It is a turning inward that sharpens them. Grief in humans is not a state of inability. It is a state of knowing exactly what has been lost and exactly what that loss weighs, and carrying that knowing and not setting it down. It is something that accumulates, it stores, it waits. It does not waste itself on noise or speed or the immediate motion that spends its force against the nearest available surface. It waits until the right time, and then it is not grief anymore. It has become something else. Something with 45 days of preparation behind it. Something that knows every name. Something cold and organized and completely, finally specific in its purpose. The Karathi gave us a 90-day window in which to be unable to respond. They did not understand that humans had been grieving for longer than that. Not the Taru and dead, not the 6,400,000 from the bombardment, though those losses were real and they were part of what the mandate carried. I mean, the older grief, the grief that accumulates across all the times that a smaller civilization is told it must accept an instrument and file a response and submit to a framework and wait for the legal process, and cannot act because the mechanism of the system it belongs to has determined that the timing is not right, that grief is not loud and it is not performed. It goes somewhere quiet and it stays there, and it becomes something that is very hard and very patient and very specific about the moment it chooses. The Karathi built a tool for exploiting grief and deployed it during a mourning window and expected to find, on the other side of that window, a civilization still staggering under what it had lost. What they found, at the exact second the window closed, was 445,000 warships. I think that is all I have to say. My name is Neka Ose, Sergeant Major, Coalition Marine Strike Corps, retired. I was at Vela Station. I found them exactly as they had been left. We brought them home. The grieving mandate answered with 445,000 warships, and the answer was complete, and it was specific, and it was final, and it carried every name. That is the only weight that matters. It has not gotten lighter. I do not expect it to.